Hello, and welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. This is Module 3.2, and we will be continuing our discussion of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, and focusing our attention on the aggregate supply curve. If you recall from the last video, we mentioned that the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model is an essential model that we're going to use to understand in a snapshot what is happening with our economy. It's going to give us an idea of why we experience growth in the long run and how our economy responds to short-run shocks. In this segment, we're going to be focusing specifically on explaining the aggregate supply curve. Now, in the ADAS model, we're going to have two aggregate supply curves. One is going to be the long-run aggregate supply curve, and this is reflecting the supply of goods and services by all firms in an economy over the long term. And the second is going to be the short-run aggregate supply curve, reflecting all of the goods and services supplied by firms in our economy in the short run. So why do we have this distinction between long run and short run? Well, in the long run, we anticipate that nominal and real variables are going to be separated in such a way that nominal variables, such as the price level, inflation, and changes in the money supply, are going to have no effect on real variables, such as real GDP. This is called the classical dichotomy. We know that this holds in the long run, but in the short run, the classical dichotomy breaks down. Specifically, in the short run, nominal and real variables are more closely intertwined, so that when we see changes in the price level or changes in money supply, it is also going to have some effect on what is happening with our real variables. So therefore, to understand what is happening in our economy, we need to separate the long run versus the short run. We'll see that changes in the short run aggregate supply are going to help explain the business cycles that we experience in our economy, and it'll help explain why we see short run shocks. So let's start off first with the long run aggregate supply curve. In the long run, our aggregate supply is going to be determined specifically by the number of available resources in our economy and the level of production technology. Recall that our resources can be categorized into three categories: land, labor, and capital. So the amount of available resources and the amount of production technology that we have in our economy are going to determine the level of aggregate supply in the long run. Remember, because the classical dichotomy holds in the long run, it doesn't matter what the price level is going to be, we're going to have the same level of output, or what we call the natural rate of output. So as you can see in this slide, output, or GDP in the long run, is going to be defined by this term, the natural rate of output. And this reflects the output or the production that we would experience in our economy if we are operating at the natural rate of unemployment. Remember, the natural rate of unemployment is an estimation by economists stripping away those business cycles or those fluctuations that we see in the short run. So if we are operating at the natural rate of unemployment, this would be the amount that we would produce in our economy. Shifts in the long-run aggregate supply are only going to come when we have permanent changes in the amount of available resources or production technology. So our long-run aggregate supply curve is only going to shift if we have a permanent change in land, labor, or capital, or if we have permanent changes in technology. So now what about the short run? Well, as you can see, the short run aggregate supply curve looks a little bit more similar to this other supply curves that we've seen thus far. It is an upward sloping line so that we see a positive relationship between the price level and quantity supplied in the short run. The reason why we have a short run aggregate supply curve, remember, is because that classical dichotomy breaks down. We see specifically a closer linkage between nominal and real variables in the short run. And this is related to what we call sticky prices and sticky wages. Because sticky prices and sticky wages occur in our economy, we have an upward sloping short run aggregate supply. So let's explore these concepts in a little bit greater detail. So sticky wages. When a firm has an agreement with its employees about the wage that it's going to pay, it sets those agreements based on its expectation of what the prices are going to be in the near future. Now, if the prices are unexpectedly low, the firm can't simply pay its employees less. Instead, it's going to have to adjust the quantity that it produces and perhaps not hire as many workers or adjust the hours that its workers are working so that it can adjust and respond to the short-run changes that it sees in the price level. On the other hand, sticky prices tell us that not all firms can change their prices in response to what's happening in the economy. Again, firms set their prices based on expectations of what's going to be happening in the near future. They make their business decisions based on expectations of what's going to be happening in the near future. So if there's an unexpectedly higher price level or unexpectedly lower price level, some firms can't necessarily change their prices automatically in response to that. Therefore, their relative prices change. So that, for example, if the price level is unexpectedly lower than they thought, and they cannot change their prices, for that individual firm, their relative price is now higher. Their price relative to other firms that can change their prices is going to be higher. Therefore, they're going to lose sales. They're going to adjust their production instead and produce less in response to this lower price level. So because of sticky wages and sticky prices, we have a situation where when we have different price levels, we're going to have different quantities supplied. In the short run, higher price levels are going to tell us that we're going to have a higher short-run aggregate supply, and lower price levels are going to tell us that we'll have a lower short-run aggregate supply. And therefore, we have an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. So now what about changes in short-run aggregate supply? When will the short-run aggregate supply curve shift? Well, there's going to be a few scenarios. The first is if we have a permanent change in available resources and technology, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift and the long-run aggregate supply curve will shift. So what impacts the long run is also going to impact the short run, in other words. Secondly, if we have temporary changes in resources or temporary changes in technology and we revert back to the original level, we'll have changes only in the short-run aggregate supply, but not the long-run aggregate supply. And lastly, as firms adjust their expectations to a new reality in the price level, we'll see an adjustment in the short-run aggregate supply. So what have we learned in this segment? Well, we've learned about the difference between the long run and the short run aggregate supplies and why we have to make a distinction between long run and short run, specifically because of the classical dichotomy. It holds in the long run, but not in the short run. We've learned about when and how the short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve shift. And next, we're going to bring together what we've learned in this segment about our aggregate supply curves with what we learned in the last segment in aggregate demand and understand the long-run and the short-run equilibriums. Thanks so much for joining me in this module 3.2 on aggregate supply.